Hey everyone, welcome back to 51% Crypto Research Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Shaughnessy. Today in the podcast, I have Jacob Arluck, who focuses on governance research at Tezos. Following 51%'s research reports on Tezos and Ethereum Serenity, I wanted to have Jacob on to discuss how governance actually works. Jacob gives us a complete overview of the process, how token holders are involved, and contrasts this with other platforms like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and others. We also talk about the rate of evolution on Tezos, attracting the global developer base that aren't involved in crypto, and the future of the platform. Interestingly, we discuss why having a simpler layer 1 can drive more use of layer 2, where applications will actually be built. For those who are unaware, our research reports on Tezos and Ethereum Serenity are the backbone of this conversation, so definitely check them out. They're linked in the show notes. Also, our listeners can use coupon code TOKEN for a great Christmas season deal in accessing all of 51%'s content. Our Tezos report is a complete deep dive into the project, its governance, and its future. And our Ethereum report covers everything Serenity, the platform's planned upgrade, and includes our strong views on what will happen to the platform over the long term. Net, I think we're talking about two of the best projects in the space, so they're worth discussing. With that, here's my conversation with Jacob. Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. Today on the podcast, I have Jacob Arluck, who focuses on governance research at Tezos. Jacob, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, nice to be here, Tom.
So I guess first off, is it Tezos or Tezos?
It's funny you say that actually, because a lot of folks for whom English is not their first language do call it Tezos. But also, a lot of us also call it Tezos, kind of like Jeff Bezos, like that kind of a pronunciation. Typically, I'd say it's either Tezos or Tezos is usually there, right? But honestly, it's a decentralized network. People can call it whatever they'd like.
Yeah, agreed. Well, Jacob, tell us about your background and how you got started in crypto.
Yeah, so had actually been following all this stuff back during undergrad. So was really interested. Have always been really interested actually in the topic of like competitive governance and like new ways of like governing, especially digital commons and things like that. So, I'd always been following the cryptocurrency space because it's always been like an obvious, like sort of beachhead in which we can sort of decentralize power, definitely on the internet and in the real world as well. But then, I sort of had this interlude. I worked in the biotechnology, space, like in the consulting firm, working with like biotech companies and whatnot. And then sort of got the bug to start, I watched in 2017, I saw there's a lot of, I just felt like there was a lot wrong in the way blockchain governance was going. And I'd always been sort of an armchair, both observer and also done like private, research on my own into these topics. And eventually one thing led to another, and I ended up getting involved in the project, to help out on this angle.
That's awesome. So I guess for those who are unaware, I guess just give us your, quick take on Tezos and just in a quick overview.
Yeah, sure. So, so just for those who don't know what Tezos is, so Tezos is a smart contracts platform. You can sort of look at it two ways, right? It's a smart contracts platform or it's programmable money if you're sort of coming from the Bitcoin angle. Tezos was originally, the way it sort of came about was back in 2014. The founders of Tezos, they were looking at it's sort of like 2017. In 2014 there was this. In 2013 there was this like explosion in altcoins that were just basically forks of Bitcoin or similar to Bitcoin, and we're basically just like trying to solve sort of coming out with interesting ways of whether it was improving scalability, like Bitcoin and G didn't end up coming out, but like just some of these ideas were circulating, right? Like Bitcoin and G, different ideas around privacy. There were a lot of, there were, sort of some, more questionable things like maybe Litecoin or things that have like sort of different mining models and whatnot. And then there's basically what happened was the Tezos founders, they sort of noted, what they observed is people in the Bitcoin community would say, well, it's fine that all these competitors are sort of popping up. Bitcoin can just, fold in all the best ideas. But as we saw with like the block size debate, like Bitcoin doesn't really have any kind of coordination mechanism that was sort of like laid out to beforehand to sort of figure out how to fold in the new innovations, and whether it's for scaling or privacy, or other things, security even. There's it's very difficult to change Bitcoin. So the narrative now with Bitcoin is that its value comes from being unable to change, right? Like it's very hard to change the core protocol. But they thought, well, this is not something, there's all sorts of things that can happen between now and 10 or 20 years down the line, when these technology is like widely used. Like somebody should create, we should create a blockchain protocol that can evolve, the one that can evolve with the times, but has a very high threshold for change. So it also is able to avoid being too easy to change, and therefore sort of unraveling the whole purpose of the technology. Something that's censorship resistant or whatnot. And so Tezos is from that, Tezos is a smart contract platform. It's basically it has a proof of stake mechanism for allocating block publishing rights. So instead of mining, Tezos uses proof of stake to prevent Sybil attacks. And then it also has it's sort of a different take on smart contracts than Ethereum. So it's not as geared towards arbitrary computation. It's more geared towards trying to create the environment where smart contracts are very secure. They can be easily eventually, it's a big research goal is to make smart contracts easy to formally verify. So if you have certain properties of smart contracts, that you want to verify, especially like against many classes of bugs or vulnerabilities, you can formally verify them. And then also the thing that Tezos is the most known for is the on-chain governance mechanism. And so that's, we can go into greater depth on how that works, but it's sort of funny because Tezos is known for that, but in reality, it's sort of innovating on like all these different, frontiers, whether it's consensus, whether it's, smart contract security, and then also the biggest, what we view as the biggest question in space, which is how is it governed and how does it upgrade itself?
Yeah, no, that's a great overview, and definitely you covered everything there. I mean, I always found it interesting that Tezos was born to solve problems that the creators saw or foresaw with Bitcoin, but these problems with Bitcoin didn't really happen yet. So that I always thought that was interesting. Like a lot of security concerns came out with Bitcoin after the fact that Tezos was kind of built to avoid or solve.
Yeah, well, I think with I think a lot of the concerns that they had really got borne out in Ethereum, right? So Ethereum sort of, it expands what blockchains can do, but didn't, at least in the view of, I think the take of the founders are just the sort of one of the motivating ideas is that, folks, projects that want to, sort of like push the technological frontier, then a lot of times they resort to centralization. So like in Ethereum, sort of the control by the core developers, the Ethereum Foundation, by Vitalik, and I'm saying it not in absolute terms, but just in sort of like relative terms to Bitcoin at least. They sort of, the idea is like, why are we resorting to centralization on these topics? We should come up with a way to do it without having to sacrifice decentralization.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So, I mean, I don't know if too many people are aware of exactly how governance works in Ethereum, Bitcoin, or even, Tezos. I think a lot of people have like their own views on how they think it happens. And I know there's a lot of vagueness on a lot of these processes and nuances, but it would definitely be interesting if you could walk us through, how the governance process works in Tezos and why it's different.
Yeah, sure. So in Tezos, basically instead of using, so in Bitcoin, sort of what's happened is there's sort of been this move to do things via soft fork, and then basically, sort of it doesn't really constrain what you can do, but because of the way the influence of the miners and the sort of the Bitcoin core community, there's sort of like it's just the meme around Bitcoin as being hard to change. Like soft forks are like sort of used for only a very limited set of things in Bitcoin. And then in Ethereum, sort of there's the use of hard forks. So, you sort of have this breaking change where basically, everyone has to then go and upgrade their software. Every time you want to upgrade it to new software. And then with Tezos, the idea is that you should just why are we using these kinds of processes in the first place? We should, if we really think this is something that's going to be the future economic infrastructure of the whole web or even the world, we should probably find a way to upgrade it more seamlessly without, needing every single person who runs a, in the Ethereum case, every single person who runs a node, and every single person who, is involved in the consensus algorithm to come to consensus on how it should change. And so the idea is, in Tezos is that you basically have this, it's broken into, the governance mechanism is broken into 4 periods, and we call it I call it, at least, I recently published a piece, they call it the amendment process, just to make it very clear how it works. And so it starts off with, a proposal period. So, and when I say proposal, it's not like proposals in if anyone's familiar with Decred, where it's sort of like funding proposal. In Tezos, a proposal is literally code. So it's in OCaml speak, it's a hash of a tarball of .ml and .mli files. So it's basically the future protocol upgrade, the future protocol, which is submitted. And then during, and then the network has about, in the current protocol has about, 8 cycles to upvote the proposals that have been submitted during that period. So then the one that's the most upvoted goes to the next period, which is also 8 cycles. And in each cycle is about 2.85 days, by the way. And so then in this next cycle, or in this next period rather, the network then decides, do we want to test this proposal? Do we want to put it on testnet? And so you need to get an 80% threshold of the quorum. And so so basically what that means is that if 80% of the quorum, and I'll explain the quorum, votes yes, then the network goes, the network progresses the proposal along to a testnet period, which also lasts 8 cycles. And this is basically just to make sure that the proposal, and it actually tested inside the protocol, but this is to make sure that it doesn't break the existing, that it can work with the existing context and state of the network. So it basically just would this, sort of prevent the blockchain from running persistently? How long can it run? These kinds of questions. And that's what that period is for. And then there's this, once that's over, it moves into this 8 cycles period in which the network can decide on whether or not to adopt this new proposal. So now you have this choice to go, and then again, it's an 80% of the quorum. And so the way the quorum works, to approve it. And so the way the quorum works is it actually follows this exponential moving average formula that I talk about in the piece that I published. It's the same thing as what was in the white paper. And there's a bunch, and I mentioned a few ways that it can be improved, just so that basically it doesn't fall too low. And so the basic idea here is that there will be coins that get lost. There will be folks who just don't want to participate at all. And the idea is you don't want the progress of the network to get stuck just because of lost coins and apathy. So you want it to be able to gradually adjust based on how much participation there is. And it doesn't just, go down. It can also, the quorum, it can also adjust upwards if, many people are participating. And so, but anyway, you need 80. So in the current, network, where the quorum is now, it would require 80% of the stake tokens to participate, and then 80% of that to say yes. So it's 60. So if you do the math on that, if everybody was staking, it would be 64% of all the tokens. And so it's 80%, it's 64%, before there's any form of adjustment to move this forward. And it has to be done twice. Like it's not just it's this testing vote and then this vote to make it the main net. And at the end of, and as I said, at the end of that last period, sort of the network, if as I said, like this call it 64% of the network says yes, then the network just activates the new protocol, doesn't hard fork.
That's super interesting, Jacob. Your overview is great. I mean, I ask you one question, you give us all the info that we ever need. I love it.
There's a bunch of like sort of clever mechanisms that were built into it by the founders and the core developers. And so it's helpful to explain all of it at once. And if you're a listener and you're like, what just happened? You can read the piece that I published the other day. It's a lot more clear.
Yeah, no, of course. But just to zoom out, I mean, just to recap everything you said. So basically, it's 4 different periods. You have the proposal period where anybody submits actual code. Then you have this voting period. Then you have the testing period where the code is actually tested on a test net, which is awesome. That sounds pretty cool.
Yeah.
And then it goes back into another testing period where it could be approved. So, I mean, one of my questions for you here, and I don't know if a lot of people really understand how this drives actual evolution of your platform over time, is that, can you compare this to the governance that we have in Ethereum, just so people can get the difference in how fast Tezos can evolve versus Ethereum?
Yeah. Well, it's not just speed, right? So not to give you a long aside, but it's also that, even if Tezos moves at the same speed as Ethereum or other protocols, it won't split the hope is that it won't split the community. And so like, that's the thing about Bitcoin, right? So like Bitcoin is able to, sort of move extremely slowly, but it doesn't split its community as much in theory because it doesn't change as much. So you can see the Bitcoin Cash split, like, et cetera, that those are a counterexample. But in reality, like the meme of Bitcoin is very much preserved by it being like, this canonical Bitcoin, right? And so in Tezos, the same idea. It's like, but in reality, it does seem like Tezos is going to move faster. So there's already, I think, a lot of ideas sort of bubbling up. So one is to probably that's been talked about for a while. It's like things like adding the sapling circuit. So doing shielded transactions and even shielded smart contracts. And then eventually, Arthur, one of the founders of Tezos, he recently published his interest in moving to Tendermint. And so that's it for block acceptance. And so that's it's not trivial by any means. Like, let's not pretend that it is. But it's much easier to implement Tendermint than to come up with some really complex like Ethereum. Like in Ethereum, you sort of have this, to contrast as you asked. In Ethereum, you have these really complex, scaling roadmaps and next generation roadmaps. And, they involve, not just, they involve all these different components. They do want to do it in phases, but like our argument is like, why not do it super gradually, like at least some of it, like why not do it as the demand for it comes? So, or at least closer to being aligned with when the demand for the network comes. So, for example, block time is a great example. So if you lower right now, Tezos was launched with a 1-minute block time, very conservatively. And the block time can be taken down. I mean, there's things that need to be, sort of addressed, like the backend database might not be able to handle going down to 5-second blocks. And also just the network in general, people might be missing blocks and whatnot. But I mean, even just reduce, in the zero net in Tezos, it's running at 30 seconds, like on the, public testnet. Like, this is not, I'm not advocating that we go to 30-second testnets for, the overall developer community to decide. But it's just idea that, like, if the community wants to double the transaction throughput per second and, increase, speed up the finality, it's just a matter of a vote, right? It's not just one vote, it's multiple votes and a testing period, but it doesn't require, this sort of like very large, this roadmap that has like all this scope creep and all these things, right? And the reason, that this happens in Ethereum is because you have to get everyone to upgrade. And, it has to be approved by sort of like, every single thing has to be approved by the core team around Ethereum. In Tezos, we can, I think a lot of folks would, as long as the network is ready, if we can go to 30-second block time, they would, we would do it, right? Or another one, a great one is lowering roll size. I think you'll see a lot of energy there. So right now, you have to have 10,000 tokens in Tezos to participate in baking. That can be lowered, by, to whether it's, 5,000 or 3,000, whatnot. It's just it doesn't have to all be, so we don't have to go from 10,000 to 1,000. We can go from 10,000 to 5,000.
No, Jacob, that's huge. And I think, one of the things that I try and think about is kind of like the speed that each of these platforms can actually evolve over, several years. And it's kind of hard to zoom in and see the process in real time. And before my listeners that love Ethereum hate me, I do love Ethereum as well. But I have to, point this out, is that one of the problems I see with governance isn't just deciding on the ideas, but the actual, curation of the process and all the developers onto a timeline, and, so they're not split into 1,000 different subgroups. It sounds like with Tezos, since the bakers have to submit code and not like abstract thought pieces, that we could actually see what's going on, so the voters can actually approve a process in real time. So I'm kind of thinking to Ethereum here, like, if Ethereum had Tezos's governance mechanism, I don't know if we would have like different subgroups working on sharding and then Casper and then put together. It sounds like it would be more streamlined, which saves a lot of time. I don't know if I'm thinking about this right or just preaching to the choir.
Well, no, I think another way of thinking about it is and a better way to think about it is like, where does the idea come from? So like when you don't have a formal governance mechanism, the folks who just like sort of created the protocol tend to be able to just control like where everything goes, like almost not unilaterally by any means. I don't think there is unilateral control of Ethereum, but around the long-term roadmap, I think there kind of is. So, with the, for example, with Casper, right? Like there have been all these different Casper ideas, whether it's CBC, the Fascinality or the Fascinality gadget. Like why? Like the thing is, like, a lot of the problems in Ethereum could be, sort of ameliorated by just like going to one of them and going to another. Like, they have, if you even just like slight improvements, like you're just going to a very, safe, but, slightly better proof of stake, algorithm, a slightly better consensus algorithm would be a lot better. Like even just going to Bitcoin and G, like where you get like 300 transactions per second, would be better than the, 10x, more than 10x better than the existing Ethereum, right? Scaling. But they don't do it because they didn't come up with the idea themselves. Folks who have like great ideas can come to the protocol and they can, recommend, they can propose changes. It doesn't have to come from the core team. And like maybe that idea is like, something that's a more gradual improvement that you want. Or maybe it's just like an improvement along one metric, like it adds privacy or it adds some really cool feature. So I think it's going to take time for this to work like this in Tezos, but we already have sort of like the groundwork for it. So we have, the folks who have been building the protocol in Paris, but then there's also, who created it, right? But then there's also like, the project at Cornell to do, sharding, you're working on sharding and proof of, another consensus algorithm for Tezos. Like the thing is, we don't even have to adopt that. We can instead go with Tendermint for a while and then shard, a year, 3 years later or 2 years later, but we'll at least have moved more gradually to meet the actual demand of, people who want to build on these technologies. Like,
that's Jacob. That's totally, just before we get off track, just a few more questions on the governance.
Yeah.
Like the framework. So I guess a few devil's advocates questions here. I mean, it sounds like it's definitely, the governance in Tezos is definitely more streamlined where token holders actually have a say and it's all in code. But I'm just wondering, like, does that process kind of displace all of the non-technical people that want to be involved in governance? Like, it seems to me like I'm not a developer or coder. So like I could tear apart Ethereum's proposals and chat in community groups, and through off-chain governance, hopefully try and influence some decisions. But with Tezos, I feel like that would be hard for me to do because I don't actually know how to get involved.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. So I think that's actually. So your question is more along the lines of like that it feels like you feel like the governance.
Yeah, like the cultural governance of off-chain versus kind of like the coding governance of on-chain. I feel like it's easier for a layperson to get involved with the cultural kind of off-chain governance like Ethereum, but I'm not sure what you think about this.
Well, I kind of feel, but I do kind of feel like there's a lot of like, there's sort of like a, I feel like in the off-chain, in projects that have like, that, I mean, almost everything is off-chain, right? In the current blockchain space, it feels to me like there's a lot of like vanity participation in this stuff. Like people are, sort of just like maybe contributing their like support to stuff that other people decided, or, they're maybe like sort of trying to argue against something, but like it's unclear a lot of times, like how many people support one thing versus another, which is a big problem, like especially around like, for example, the Parity wallet hack or the Parity wallet freeze rather. There was sort of like a lot of lack of clarity around like how many people really, they did this like sudden coin vote, it sort of came out one way, but like, you don't have that many people actually directly participating. You only get like the people who care to show up. Whereas in Tezos, the governance is more about like it may actually be in Tezos that less people are talking about stuff and more people are like silently or quietly voting. And I think that's actually not the worst thing in the world. Like, I think that's actually probably a positive thing. It's just more of a question of like, if you see something that you don't like, you can just vote. You or your baker that you choose can vote to say, to just, signal and not just signal, but directly prevent, that change from happening. And maybe
that's interesting.
Yeah.
And so how would but I mean, so another question I have on this topic, while you're on the thought is, people don't want to sit around and vote all day with their tokens on every little change, right? Exactly. So one of the things Tezos does, which is great, is you delegate your votes to a baker. There's over 100 of them and they vote for you. So a question for you, two questions is, how easy is it to delegate your votes to a baker? And the second question I have is, how do people know, the goals and hopes and dreams of each baker? Do they just look at their past history, or do I vote for Arthur Brightman, who kind of leads Tezos? If he runs a baker, how exactly do I get info on the bakers?
Yeah, no, good question. So I actually think part of this is resolved by the fact that bakers, like the threshold is very high. So like you need 80% of the, of the tokens. So therefore, of the stake tokens. So like, it's really going to be a yes or no kind of thing on in a lot of these cases. Like, I don't. It's a hard question to say. The question is like, are people, when they select a baker, deciding on what they, selecting their baker based on like their political, their views about the future of the protocol? No, I mean right now that's definitely not the case. But like the way it works, right, is that like when you delegate your tokens for baking, you also delegate your vote. And I personally, I think we should slightly amend that to be where that's sort of like the default decision, but also that if you're a small token holder, you can secretly override your baker. So if they vote, you see how they vote, you can then, sort of secretly override their vote. If they vote yes and you prefer that they vote no, you can just quietly override their vote, and they wouldn't even know because it would all be tallied at the end, or a different, you wouldn't know, or it would be tallied at like whatever different checkpoint along the process. But the idea is, so we haven't seen that yet. Like to answer your question directly, we haven't seen that yet because we haven't had any proposals yet. But when we do have proposals, so I think over the next year you're going to see that for sure. The question is, what is there really to have a lot of contentious debate about right now in Tezos? There's just not that much. Like I think, because it was written on OCaml, there's definitely like a self-selection of programmers. There's not a lot of, there's no competing developer teams to the folks in like major competing developer teams to the folks in Paris quite yet. But I think like down the line, this is something that could totally emerge where you have, a lot of bakers who sort of like form a, I don't want to say a political party by any means, but because I think that having a high approval threshold for each vote like actually discourages factionalism to some extent.
Jacob, I totally agree. But I mean, don't you think that the community could grow and like prosper if we had, what if we had like 100 different political parties on Tezos and they're all bakers? Like, I feel like it would get a lot of the off-chain people kind of more socially involved with the process. But I totally hear you that there isn't like anything really contentious to vote on yet. But I think if Tezos is successful, there definitely will be.
Yeah, no. You're totally right. So totally. And I think Tezos is obviously, created with the idea that there will be a lot of contentious things down the line. And all that matters is that, that it, sort of keeps its network together and makes, some good decisions, or at least the not bad ones. Right. I think, it's a hard trade-off, right? Because I guess
we need a user interface to like track all these block producers and show what they're all changing.
Yeah. So I think there will definitely be. So first of all, let me explain how I expect the interface to evolve. So there was a recent protocol update, just for security a few weeks ago, and in that update they pushed out some voting RPCs. So basically allows you to, query like, how many votes have been given to a certain proposal, what proposals there are, like these kinds of questions. And I think there will be a lot of interface. I think what's cool is I think there's going to be a whole bunch of interfaces that emerge that, like I don't think there'll just be one. I think there'll be a number of interfaces that allow you to upvote proposals. So during the proposal period, they'll allow you to, there'll be like 5 proposals, and whether maybe for example, it's about roll size. Maybe, somebody proposes, okay, here's, we're going to lower roll size to 3,000. Okay, here's another proposal. We're going to lower roll size to 5,000. And here's another one where we're going to lower it to 8,000. With pros and cons, next to it. And this is a sort of not the best example, but it just gives you a sense of what I'm talking about. And so basically, folks will upvote one of these proposals. That one will go, to the yes or no vote in the next period. But I think there will be a slick interface for bakers around that eventually, for sure. And then if eventually, the right to vote is separated from the consent to the right to participate in baking, which I think partly, in part is a good idea. Doing it in a careful way is probably a good idea. Then I think you'll have more generalized interfaces that are built into wallets, that are built into, like things that basically will allow a user to say, okay, am I going to follow what my baker said, or am I going to just, go with, my own vote because I don't agree with what they're trying to do. I think that kind of interface could exist, probably in a 2-year time frame, or 1.5, 2 years. I could reasonably see something like that. If we split the right to vote from the right to bake, that's something that could happen. It won't happen, tomorrow, but it could definitely happen in the 1 to 2 years time frame.
No, that's interesting. So Jacob, I mean, have you seen any have there been any contentious? I know you said there hasn't been, but has there been any? I know if not contentious votes, has there been a lot of successful votes so far? And if so, can you share? What those were, or like what the participation was, or anything like that?
No. So we haven't. And don't think it's wrong. We actually haven't voted yet. So we're sort of. I think the way that folks have viewed it is like, let's let the network get its sea legs. And it's pretty hard to launch one of these things. They're pretty complex distributed systems. But now we feel. I think in general, I think a lot of folks feel that the network is in good shape. We're moving towards we're soon going to be ready to do a first vote. Originally it had always been communicated that the first vote would probably happen in January. We'll see. It may happen in the next might happen sooner depending on.
Yeah, Jacob, I think I confused it with that Tezos tweet I saw where it was a little confusing, but the Tezos tweet was like approval voting voted best voting procedure by voting experts. And I thought that a vote had taken place recently or something, but that was a while ago.
Yeah, well, approval voting is what Tezos uses in the first period, right? So in that period, we've been calling it upvoting, but it's actually approval voting. And what all that means is, so let me explain approval voting. So the idea of approval voting is that you have I'm making this up, let's say you have 20 options and you're allowed to vote on as many as you'd like. And then the one that is the most voted on, the one that basically has the least no votes, basically, that one is the one that is considered the most upvoted. So in Tezos, they would be like, if we have if 5 of us vote and we each vote for each of us vote differently, and then one of the options we all vote for, so it has all basically that one that had the 5 votes would be the most voted proposal, and that would be the one that goes to the next round. So the reason this is a great voting mechanism is because it means that it's the closest to consensus, right? So basically it's the one that the way it really means is what it really means is that it's the one that the one that gets selected is the one that has the least has the most it's just the close to consensus in the sense of it has the least down votes or the least no votes, if that makes sense. So
got it. No, that's interesting. Jacob, I don't want to get lost in this specific topic though. I think we'll go down a rabbit hole. We'll be talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Voting theory is actually a much more complex thing than people realize. But yeah, totally
No, it totally is. So I guess, are there any amendments or any ideas floating around the Tezos community that you think will come up for vote soon, or anything like that? Or is it kind of just wait and see?
I'm going to say wait and see, but I'll tell you, I think you should keep your eyes out for some stuff I think coming. Definitely there will be some stuff, I think in the next few weeks or months.
Awesome. So Jacob, voting rolls out in the next few weeks on Tezos?
Well, no. So that's just it. So it's actually been live since it launched, but it was a little unclear to people how it works. It worked, and so that was the purpose of my post last week or whenever it was the week before. To just explain to people actually, this thing is so. I should have clarified earlier when a proposal period ends, that first voting period. If nobody submitted anything, then it goes to a new proposal period, and so that's basically what has been happening since June 30th. So we've been no one's been proposing anything, and that's not a bad thing. It's actually probably a good thing because the network was getting its sea legs. It had been launched as a beta net, and now it's been almost live for 3 months as a on mainnet. And so, it's probably for the better to, a lot of these projects, for example, that are going to have on-chain, some kind of on-chain mechanism like Cardano, for example, they're not even going to do it until 2020 or maybe even later. And I think that's a reasonable thing to some extent, but the idea is just it's something you want to be careful with. It's definitely an experimental thing. It's a new, all blockchain technologies are experimental technology, and the voting mechanisms are another experimental technology on top of an experimental technology. So we want to be really careful. We definitely think that it's a better mechanism than off-chain governance, which has had a lot of issues around coordination and stalled innovation and stuff like that.
I totally understand that the process is.
We definitely want to be careful with rolling it out.
No, I totally understand. So Jacob, I just had a podcast with Gregory Rocco and Jacob Blitch from Alpine at Consensus, and they're huge on token design. They're really bright guys. Definitely listen to that podcast if you guys haven't. But one of the things that they pointed out, and I feel like people gloss over this, is the governance at layer one, like on Tezos, on Ethereum, on Bitcoin, influence all of the decisions on all of the applications built on top of them, no matter what they are. So everyone points to EOS for high transactions per second, but they forget that they're held by, the ideas of 15 or 21 block producers, whatever the quorum is there. So I think governance is extremely important on layer one. And I don't think people really understand that. Do you think about that a lot, or I'm assuming you do, but I'm just wondering how you think about like the applications and smart contracts built on top of Tezos, because in the future, I'm sure it'll be hopefully a lot more valuable than it is now.
Yeah, no, that's an awesome question. So the first thing I'd say is that, so that's actually, I think, the biggest argument for, doing some kind of formal governance. But it's also a really strong argument against doing bad formal governance, right? So like things like, or things that are, sort of create new kinds of fragility or whatever. So in Bitcoin, there's this argument that layer one, Bitcoin is actually a great place to, for example, build Lightning Network, other than the fact that Bitcoin script is difficult to use, but in the fact that it won't change, when you then go to build a layer two, scaling solution, it's like a nice place to do it because it's not going to really change that much. So now, okay, fine, let's put all the innovation on layer two. In Ethereum, it's a little more complex because they're still trying to change a lot of things on the base layer with a governance process that, by their own sort of admission, needs a lot of work. And one of the interesting things that came out in the last few months was, Vitalik's blog post about how he thinks that layer one, should be innovative in the short term and, very conservative in the long term. And I think we totally agree with that. So in Tezos, one of the ideas, I think it's in the white paper, or maybe it's in a talk that Arthur gave, and it's basically the idea that like the number of changes that should happen, to the base layer probably need to happen. Most of them will be clustered in the first however many years, and then the rate of change should go down because you just have a lot more. Either you have a lot more value accruing to these networks. They're all of a sudden making a change could theoretically impact lots and lots of money, and so therefore there's a lot more risk involved in upgrading it. Whereas building something with smart contracts or on layer two will entail a lot less of that risk. And then the other thing is, that there's also just going to be like that any future engineering changes to these blockchains, like laid down in the future, like to some extent, what I'm about to say isn't true because of substrate, but parity substrate. But it's just these things are going to could become very complex. And down the line, it might involve, changing one thing might involve significant changes to, involve a lot more change.
But hopefully the voting pool will be globally distributed at that point, and there'd be more stakeholders, and changes would be easier for things that are more relevant, hopefully. But we've been talking a lot about governance, which is not only deciding on changes, but kind of curating the whole process and streamlining it, which I don't think people talk about enough. But the other thing I want to talk about with you is not only deciding on decisions to implement, but just taking one step back is the creation of these changes. So, and that goes back to your developer community. How is Tezos going to compete with Ethereum's developer community? I know you probably get this question a lot, and everybody knows how big Ethereum's developer community is, and just definitely want to hear your thoughts here.
Yeah, no, thanks. So that's a good question. So, and I think this actually is a great time to point out like difference in approach between Tezos and Ethereum too. So, there's a really awesome fora, I think it's on Fora, where somebody asked, how is Tezos different than Ethereum? And I believe it was Arthur who replied. He makes this point that's like really always stuck with me, which is that, Ethereum, a lot of things are sort of geared towards developers as if the end user of Ethereum is a developer. So it's like, it makes it very easy to get fundraising via a token, an ERC20 token. It makes it very easy to deploy smart contracts because, you can write it in JavaScript, or Solidity, which is like JavaScript, similar to JavaScript, and this sort of thing. But in Tezos, sort of the tack that was taken was that actually it's not developers who are really going to use these things. It's actually users who are going to use these things, like people. Like people are going to use these things. And the idea is that, the idea that you need, a million developers building on these things is not obvious because, like, for example, a lot of the things that get used will just be reused, smart contracts over and over. Like, there's probably not that many smart contract types that necessarily people will use, like multi-sigs and those sorts of things, for sure. But I mean, there's not that many things, at least right now, they're obvious that that need to be done on chain and require specialized smart contract developer community. Like, in reality, maybe, and also Camel and other, functional programming languages, they're pretty, efficient, and the developers tend to be much more talented, which is not, I'm not trying to, it's not a cop-out answer, but it's really, having, even, I think to someone recently, like, even just having a formally verified multi-sig that's widely deployed, like, would be a big step forward for a lot of the space, given.
No, Jacob, your point is really insightful. Like, people don't think about that. The end users are actual consumers, and developers. That's huge. But, just building on your question, I mean, let's say that Tezos and Ethereum's base layer were finished or completed tomorrow, right? Or something like that. How are you guys going to convince, though, that, like, the majority, or not the majority, just more developers or more insightful developers to build applications on Tezos versus Ethereum? Because even if the base layer is fixed, I mean, we definitely have to build, real applications on this stuff.
Yeah, so I think there's folks working on, like, things like, light nodes and things that will make it, like, so that you don't really, like, some of the smart contract logic obviously requires, like, sort of like more specialized knowledge, but the rest of the application you build does not. And so I think that'll onboard a lot of folks. There have been folks in the community who are talking about doing Rust client, Rust shell, and basically that would, allow us to onboard, a lot of Rust developers, folks who want to do, like, Rust API, Rust libraries, these sorts of things. Then there's things like Reason ML, people who are talking about, like, just like a JavaScript, like OCaml hybrid, like, language and sort of thing. It's a bad way of explaining it, but that's basically what it is. And there's going to be, I don't really worry about creating a developer community to rival Ethereum's, because Ethereum developer community is, it's the vast majority of the developers in the blockchain space. It's a tiny fraction of all the developers in the world, and it's an even tinier fraction of all the great developers. And so Tezos is trying to, and also there's another angle, which is that, a great example is even just looking at Bitcoin, right? Like, there's still a bunch of development going on in Bitcoin, even though it's annoying to work on, right? And the reason is because it has powerful network effects and, has this, sort of, meme around decentralized governance that's hard to change, et cetera, that, like, makes it an attractive place to build, whether it's Lightning Network or, like, a blockchain side chain, these kinds of things. And, there's lots of demand there because there's lots of value there. And so I think there's a lot more to be gained from taking an approach where you try to create, like, what this concept of, like, a fat money, like I think is it Murad or one of the Bitcoin maximalist people who, like, sort of has this line of, this phrase, like, fat money rather than fat protocol. And I think that Tezos takes that, is designed to take a similar approach where you don't want to have that many people building stuff on it per se. What you want is just people building the right stuff and, like, lots of value being able to prove there. So, like, asset, for example, if you just create an asset issuance framework, or like the equivalent of, like, ERC20 or some of these, like, whitelist token, standards on Ethereum, all of a sudden you can build, like, massively valuable things on Tezos, in the tokenized equity, tokenized real estate, security token type space on Tezos without, having a million developers, and also, there's another angle would be that, there's a lot of the things that the developer community in Ethereum are used. Like, there's way more developers in Ethereum than there are users, right? That's, I guess, the larger point that I'm making. Like, there's probably, whether that's actually true, I don't know, but it's way closer. The difference is way closer, than it should be.
No, that's interesting. So, Jacob, I mean, just to zoom out, what you're saying, if I'm if I'm understanding correctly, is that if you have not a dumb layer one, but like a perfected layer one that's not too complex, you can have way more growth on applications and cool use cases on layer two because everybody knows what's happening on layer one and it's not extremely complex, kind of like Ethereum's current roadmap.
Yeah, well, also, I think one of the original ideas with Tezos is that because it has this formal governance mechanism, you can like put more stuff into the base layer possibly. So like there's like, you could, it doesn't, maybe it's multi-sig, but also, things like decentralized exchange protocol could be in part, part of the base layer protocol, like stuff like that. Like it's probably easy. So that's another point that like the Ethereum found, like the Vitalik and those folks have taken a very different view of where, in that piece I alluded to earlier, he sort of points out like, if you put lots of features into layer one, then it requires all this governance overhead. They don't believe in that kind of governance, formal governance overhead requirements on the base layer. I think we take a different view, which is that that's a more like reasonable thing. I mean, there's things you can do around like making it easier to do auctions or, other things that like could be built. You could do one idea that Arthur has talked about is putting adding prediction market functionality into the base layer itself, as a future form, to inform a future form of governance. But also just to use those predictions to create prediction markets, just create prediction market contracts. And you can do this in the base layer. And then, what ends up happening is that this allows, because you're using the native Tezos token, it allows for like way more value to accrue to this Tezos token or way more network effects around the XTZ Tezos token. And the idea is that like you want lots of folks sort of internalized into the same, like basically what you're trying, let me explain it in a different way. What you want is like for like a person holding the XTZ token, you want there to be as few hops, as few transaction costs, like things that they need to do or steps that they need to take to do all these complex or different financial transactions. So like if I'm holding the XTC token, imagine that instead of just like in Ethereum, like, okay, I have to move it into ZRX or I have to move it into, even like, stablecoins are a better example, but some other token, Aragon token, for example. Like instead I hold this token and I can use all these things with no hops, with very little friction between me and all this functionality. That's like, I think that's the best way to understand the Tezos vision. And the only way you can do that is with like governance baked in from the start, because you have to be able to maintain or upgrade or, improve some of these things. And whether or not these things are super, complex on the base layer remains to be seen. But I think you'll see a lot of features that are baked into the base layer rather than built just as, pure smart contract functionality on the DApp layer. And as a result, that means you need less development. Like,
Got it. Well. No, Jacob, that's totally interesting. Totally makes sense. I definitely understand it. And I guess that money plus for, I guess it must be a plus for new developers that want to join that aren't involved with crypto, but that are just global developers because there's millions of them. But I have one last question for you. I listened to Arthur and Kathleen's podcast. I think it was on Epicenter a few months ago, and Arthur kind of brushes off the idea of, decentralized applications or dApps and doesn't really, I don't know if the Tezos community really points to scale. I kind of get the feeling that the Tezos community kind of says, okay, we could just throw scale on later with like a Lightning Network or Plasma or something like that. I feel like scale is really important on layer 2, though. I mean, are there scaling initiatives on Tezos that are being worked on?
Yeah, so there totally are. So they're not public yet, but there will. I think you'll hear soon in the next few weeks or like month or two that they're, whether it's Plasma, whether it's, I think there's some folks looking at payment channels and, things like this. There's a lot more of this. One of the challenges we have with Tezos is like there's a lot of things going on. And a lot of a lot of the folks are not, super keen on promoting it the way that folks in the Ethereum space or the OS space or whatever are about, like, sort of saying their protocol is the best and their projects are the best and whatever. Tezos is much more like, a lot of the for example, the developers who created the Tezos protocol, they, come from a academic background where, weird to be talking up your idea as like the best thing ever, right? And pile that on top of them being French, and you sort of have this different norms around like promoting things. But yeah, you totally will see that. I think the most important thing for Tezos. So Tezos has always taken this approach of, or been geared, the network was designed with the idea that layer 2 would be where all the heavy computation, layer 2 or even off chain, entirely, obviously layer 2 is sort of the same, but all the heavy computation will not happen on base layer by any means. It's just a settlement like layer for business logic, basic business logic and issuance and ownership. Plasma. So the idea is like, in order to have things like Plasma and whether it's state channels or all sorts of complex scaling solutions, what you really want is like fast finality and safety, like in your consensus algorithm. And so that's why Arthur has been talking a lot about Tendermint. And Tendermint, the idea is like, you do, I don't know how much Azure systems but it's like basic, and I'm not no expert there either. The way I understand it is like it's that the idea is to do business unit agreement on every block, for example, and then you have finality, on every block that this has been done on, right? Or the chain stops. And the idea is there is that then when you go build these second layer solutions, it's very you don't have to worry about any kind of reorganizations or sort of destabilizations because of like forks and whatnot. That you have to worry about in Bitcoin right now. And so you can build all sorts of like whether it's interoperability, whether it's side chains, whether it's Plasma, Plasma side chain, but Plasma, state channels, these sort of things. These things become a lot more viable when you have like fast finality and you have an orientation towards safety. And so I definitely think that you'll see that happening as well. And that's like a key part of the.
No, that's super interesting. Well, Jacob, before I let you go, I mean, this has been a great discussion on governance. Is there any like key aspects that we may have missed or anything that you're working on that you wanted to share or talk about?
So nothing, what I would say to listeners is like really, there's going to be a lot coming in the next few, 2 to 3 months. Like, I think there'll be some stuff in the next few weeks or so, month or so, and then you'll see a lot more stuff in the next, coming months, that is really exciting. So, probably the first upgrade will, happen, I think within the next few months, whether it's the first vote or whatnot, there'll be really neat second layer project. There will be people announcing, I think there's a lot of folks who want to build stuff on Tezos and have been, slow to announce it and stuff like this. I think there's a lot of cool stuff that's been happening slowly but surely, and with great care. Sort of with the hope of not hyping it too much. And so I think folks will find this very very exciting. It's just just hang in there and wait and see.
Yeah, Jacob, last question for you. Any idea what gets us out of this bear market?
No, I think honestly the answer there is just real world use. I mean, I don't, not even in the sense of like price, but just like nobody's using these things, and these technologies. Like I think interesting new financial applications are cool. Whether one of the things I really like are like these projects that are sort of like using the DAI stable, on Ethereum, for example, using the DAI stable coin as like as a primitive. I think gaming will be cool. Definitely gaming is like something where I see, sort of an internet native use case for, sort of this native use case for blockchains because they're internet native. So if you're playing some kind of collaborative game on the internet, definitely think there'll be users on board that way. Whether that translates to price, I have no idea, but or whether it translates into widespread adoption, I can't comment there. But there's definitely a lot of opportunity, I think, for people to try to be very thoughtful and careful about creating new things that get potentially get used by billions of people with great consequence. So it's not just like creating a game that has little consequence. There's a lot of financial value and social value on the line in these platforms, and it might take a while before we have the infrastructure that can handle the whole world, economic infrastructure for the whole world. So
that's super interesting. Well, Jacob, thank you so much for coming on, and we'll definitely look to have you on again soon.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. Please rate and review the podcast to help other people find it, and visit 51pct.io and use coupon code TOKEN to get 20% off any subscription before this offer ends.